This is not to cover how to judge or like the very basics of judging and fundamentals related to that, because I think there's enough resources regarding that. But the primary resource there is just the manual. So my number one advice is get really, really familiar with the manual, and you can watch a bunch of judging workshops. There's an excellent training series by the world score of 22, I think, Belgrade or Korea, one or the other, which you could refer to, which covers a lot of what we're going to cover today in some level of detail. There's also a bunch of resources that you can take reference to. I think it was in part by Korea and part by Belgrade, or maybe I'm wrong, whatever. But yeah, so refer to those. I think we can share links later if you want those, or if you ask for links, you will find them there as well. So, uh, ground rules for debating. Oh, ground rules for the session, sorry. And also for debating. Always take notes. So when you're on a round, always make sure you know what's happening in the round, and this is regardless whether you're judging. But also during this session, take notes. So if later you have doubts, or even if while listening to us you have doubts, you know exactly what to ask or what you had the doubt about. Feel free to ask questions at any point and fill in the feedback for this session. So Rohan and the rest of the people at office hours can know what to do, like know what is needed or know what else people want to look at. Cool. Yeah. So a lot of what we're going to cover today, especially because it relates to things that are not strictly like the base theory of debating, are going to be anecdotal or things that we've seen or learned from other people. So it's not perfect knowledge, because perfect knowledge one doesn't exist, but especially with regard to debating, a lot of these softer aspects of things like judging are not necessarily universal. So what works for me or Rushdoon may not work for you, and vice versa, right? So listen to what we say, take the advice, see if it works, and if it doesn't work for you, it's always something you always explore other things. There's lots of different ways to do everything. And so it'll be a theme throughout the session where we will give you advice, but there are ways that everything we're going to cover are done that are different from how we do it. And those are valid, and you should absolutely develop your own personal approach to judging and debating in general. And that's just the other bit of advice that I have. Cool. Next slide is how to track. Cool. I'll be covering, so the broad outline of this session before I begin with how to track is I'll cover tracking, and I'll cover whatever's on the slide. So different modes of tracking, what to track, how much detail, how to look at an extension when you're judging BP, etc., etc. Rustum will then talk about weighing and sort of one walk you through, I think, to some extent, the bench weighing changes that have happened in the manual, and also just how to properly weigh. I think Rushnu will also cover a couple of exercises with regard to how to weigh and stuff like that. Followed by which we will have two segments, which again I will cover with regard to how to be a useful panelist or how to contribute meaningfully in a panel discussion. One in a way that makes the panel discussion better, but also two in a way that like guarantees that you get a decent score, right? Not guarantees, but increases the probability that you get a decent score. Next, we'll talk about how to chair, what to do as a chair, as a first-time chair, or even someone who has a bit of experience but wants to know what they can do differently. That's what we'll cover next. And lastly, I think Rushdu and I will both pitch in on OAs and how to go about those. Cool. So, how to track? There is an extensive like amount of information out there with regard to how to track, and a lot of information that you get on how to track is likely to vary between sources. And this is for a simple reason. It's that tracking is something that's very personal. That is, how I track one round or my notes for one round may look quite different to the notes that Rohan makes or the notes that Rushtun makes. And this, at least in my opinion and experience, arises out of just how different people think about a round and how different people perceive the flow of a round, right? So the number one thing that your notes should do is they should serve you in recollecting the round, but also they should reflect how you view the round. So maybe it makes more sense for you based on how you track to take pen and paper notes, or it makes more sense to take digital notes, or it makes more sense to go into a lot of detail because you can perhaps type faster, or it makes sense to like not go into much detail because it'll distract you. A lot of these things are very personal. So the disclaimer, and especially on this part of the session, the disclaimer is that at the end of the day, the objective must be to develop your own style of note taking, develop your own like system which helps you approach note taking in a meaningful way, which helps you make your notes a useful tool in deliberation and like aid your memory and whatnot, right? So there's that. So I'll quickly cover the first biggest question that comes to note taking, right? Especially in like a post-COVID world and whatnot. Whether you should take notes on paper or digitally. So I personally use both systems and I go back and forth between them. I know lots of people who do exclusively digital notes and exclusively paper notes. But I'll just quickly discuss what the process of making paper. Yeah, Rishan, what's up? Okay, maybe.
I think he just had his hand up. You can continue.
Oh, yeah, cool. No, so yeah, he raised his hand. I thought it was a question. Yeah, cool. So on paper, the way I take notes is I like to have like large A4 sheet. I like to split it in half, like an A4 sheet, like not a large A4 sheet. I like to fold it in half, and one side is dedicated to Gov, one side is dedicated to Op, and I'll just take down all my notes in that order. Now, different people take paper notes differently. So I have seen excellent judges who just have one sheet on which they track the entire debate, and that works for them, and they're able to contribute extremely meaningfully towards the round. And this is also to an extent based on, I mean, how your notes look is also to an extent dependent on how good your memory is. So I have a like I don't have an extremely good short-term memory, so I tend to take down slightly more detailed notes in more complex rounds. So I'm able to I can be sure in deliberation that I haven't missed something that and thereby do disservice to the teams, right? So how you structure notes on a sheet of paper will vary by what your approach is to judging. I've already said this. Um, so what I would recommend as a good starting option is that you can just have one sheet per team. The reason I do like two halves of the same sheet is that it helps with like comparing between teams. So if I have one sheet where I have both PM and LO, I'm able to directly compare what PM has said and what LO has said and sort of streamlines that thought process for me. And I think plenty of people do it this way as well. And it helps with comparisons because then when you're making those notes on pen or on paper, you're able to directly correlate to say, suppose PM has framed the debate in a certain way and LO has challenged that framing, you're able to make those direct side by side connections and assess how those things play out against each other, right? So that's just one way to look at it. The other recommendation I have is I would recommend that you just like you have at least two colors. And the reason I would recommend this is that it makes it much easier to differentiate between the two teams, right? Um, but also it can help you with regard to sort of clarifying what went on in the debate. So I personally use three different colors while judging. I'll use one team for prop, one color for prop, one color for op, and one color to put in my comments. And this is something that's I think like agnostic of whether you're doing pen paper notes or digital notes. But I think it's extremely important that throughout the debate, as you're tracking, you should put in your own notes as regards to how you weight something or what your thoughts of something are, whether you think something is proven or not, whether you think that something is on clash or off clash. These aren't going to be detailed notes. So often on my sheets, if I'm not sure what the impact of something is, I'll just have a question mark next to that claim, or I'll just have like one so what next to that claim. But this looks different for different people. Again, that's the consistent disclaimer. The idea then is that on paper, you want to have as much sort of differentiation between the two teams in terms of like color or in terms of physically where they are. So if you're using one sheet per team, it makes sense. Like one sheet per speech, one sheet per team, whatever else. I've seen people use like notebook sheets. I think you can absolutely do that. Like you can have one notebook which you can just have as your judging notebook or your debating notebook. And I've seen people have excellent success with that as well. Like it's not compulsory for you to have A4 sheets. Uh, it's not compulsory for you to have unruled sheets. The basic idea is just that you should be able to track things properly, right? One of the minor drawbacks to pen paper notes is that the speed of writing things by hand is not comparable to speed of typing, especially if you're a like slightly more proficient typer. You can probably type much faster than you can write by hand, right? So there, one thing that you should keep in mind while taking pen and paper notes is that you practically cannot write down every word that somebody has said, right? Um, and this is both an advantage and a disadvantage of digital note taking. The advantage is that you can take down much more detail about the round. The disadvantage that comes with that is that there's this tendency to just become a stenographer, in that it's very common. in my experience, for less experienced judges who are taking digital notes, to just write down everything, every single word that happened in the round, or as close to it as they can get. I would warn against taking this approach just because it detracts from your ability, or detracts from my ability, and is likely to detract from your ability to actually think about the round, right? If you're focusing on writing down every single word that's said, that takes away one from a bit of your thinking power during the round, but also two, at the end of the round, leaves you with far too much material to meaningfully read during or in the couple of minutes before deliberation, right? So on pen and paper, and this is one of the reasons why I prefer pen and paper sometimes for offline comps, the natural restriction in terms of just your handwriting speed is likely to mean that you are less prone to falling into this sort of trap of just ending up writing everything that happened in the round. But if you are a person who needs more detail or who has a worse memory, or if you are a person who just benefits from having every single word that was said in the round written down, that is perhaps an opportunity where taking digital notes might help, wherein it might help you just take down much, much more because you can type much faster. There's also other benefits to taking digital notes in that, like, you can do a bunch of things. Like if you have just a table, you can probably have like three different columns. This is what I do when I have kind of digital notes, right? I notes have three columns, one for blog, one for up, and one in the middle for comments. You can also probably modify your font to note down different types of claims. You can probably also highlight claims that are important. You can also probably most likely just change colors of fonts and stuff like this. There's a lot more customization you can do on digital notes you can't do on pen and paper, just because like there's more digital tools than there are physical tools. Of course, you could show up to around with like three different highlighters and four different colored pens and a scale and stickers and whatnot, but it's just much harder to do that level of customization on pen and paper notes. So if you are the kind of judge, or if in your experience you have felt that you need to sort of annotate your notes throughout around much, much more, or you feel the need to have that sort of extreme customization or differentiation between notes, perhaps in that instance, I would recommend taking digital notes. At the end of the day, the basic answer to whether you should take pen paper notes or digital notes is, I think you should try both. I think pen paper notes are just much more accessible in that you can just pick up a sheet of paper and start writing, right? And it's also something that's like tried and tested. It's something debaters have been doing for ages. So, and it generally works. I would recommend, if you're new to judging, or if you have started judging recently or during the COVID era and you just use digital notes, I would recommend trying out pen and paper notes. I would recommend starting doing a couple of mocks or rounds with pen and paper notes so you can just get an idea of whether you like it or not. And there's nothing wrong with going back and forth. I often go back and forth. I will do pen paper notes for one round. Within the same comp, I'll do pen paper notes for one round. I'll do digital notes for the next. There's no hard and fast rule that you have to do the same thing throughout. At the end of the day, whatever serves your needs as a judge is what you should do. And that brings me to the next talking point in terms of how much detail to go into. I think I've covered this to some extent when I told you about how you shouldn't just be stenographing. But it's important to note that your job as a judge is not to recount what happened in the debate. Your job as a judge is not to sort of just record the debate. Your job as a judge is to assess what happens in the round, or assess what happens in the debate, and arrive at a conclusion with regard to how those arguments weigh out against each other. So, the first thing I would say is that you should be wary of any tendency wherein you're just like turning off your brain and writing down things that happen in the round. That should never be happening. And the reason that should never be happening is that even if you are later able to wade through these extensive notes you've written down everything else, unfortunately, just because of how debate rounds work, you're not going to be in a you're not going to be in a position where you're going to be able to like wade through your 30 pages of notes in the 2 minutes that you have to think, right? You need to reach an initial call fast, which means you need to have thought about the debate while it happens, which means you should be focusing some amount of time during taking notes into just thinking about the debate. So the answer to how much detail to go into is, again, how much ever detail you need to be able to reach a call at the end of the debate and to be able to sort of track the claims. So what I would recommend is you should obviously have all the argument headers. I think you should obviously have the basis of the frame that the team is making. So if the team has made certain claims about the world, You need to track down one, what are the claims they've made? Two, have they proven these claims? Because a frame isn't just like a truth, like just believed because it's said, right? You have to prove those things. So, what is the claim? What are the lines of analysis provided as proof for that claim? And whether, in your opinion, this is where I think annotating comes up a bit, whether, in your opinion, it's proved or not. I think these three minimal things have to be there. In regard to how much detail, that's just a personal choice at the end of the day to just do that. As to how to track extensions, I think to a large extent, a lot of this is just approach extension speeches in terms of tracking as if they were just first like opening speeches. And by that I mean write down everything they say. If they make a claim, write down the claim and write down the proof. If they make a if they make a response, write down the response and write down the proof. In the aftermath of that note taking, you should probably assess whether this is identical or not. But especially because bench weighing is extremely important, and after the manual changes, you as a judge need to do it yourself as well. You need to have kept track of what the closing teams have said in a fair amount of detail, which is why I think it's still necessary to take down the claims and the defenses for those claims and the analysis provided thereon. So you can compare it very directly with what the opening teams say, right? So I would also avoid this tendency wherein you don't write down things that opening said because they're repetitive. You still need to write them down. If it's the exact same thing, like if literally word for word the same, perhaps don't write it. But if you suspect there might be something different going on there, I would highly encourage you to just write it down as well. Sort it out once that speech is over, figure out whether it's unique or not after that speech is over. I will hand over to Rushdoon to talk about vague. I think that's sort of the natural extension of what I've just talked about.
Okay. Hi everyone. Firstly, thank you so much to Rohan for inviting me on this escapade. I would say from a lot of work. And like it's a very great initiative that Rohan has taken in terms of like bringing together these sort of classes which we like don't do often. So what I'm gonna do is yeah, I'll come to the aspect of weighing, but before that, I'll just offer my 2 cents. One, in terms of like just prescriptively, how should you think about being like what is a good judge, and secondarily, just some add-ons to Ojas in terms of tracking. So Ojas, if you can just go like one slide behind, I just don't want to elongate that further, but I'll wrap up pretty quickly. And then I'll just answer Pratham's question over here in terms of tracking replies. Post which we'll just go on to weighing pretty quickly over there. There have been manual changes from the Panama WDC CA team, but I would not say these manual changes are very extreme. If you want a very good sense of what they specifically mean, I would like advise you to go and watch Kat Cheng's video on a briefing on Sydney Mini 2024. So I'll just write it down in the chat. So Sydney Mini 2024 has this briefing with the new changes in the manual being updated and explained very well by Kat in this instance. Just give me a second.
I'll send the link in chat. Give me a second.
Yeah, yeah. I hope this is audible because I think there's some background noise. Ojus, is this
Yeah,
perfectly
you're
audible?
audible. You're audible.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, cool, cool. Right. In terms of like, okay, what do you mean by a good judge? Okay, and I think Ojus has covered this a bit, like in terms of okay, it's subjective. It differs from person to person. But I would like to add on to this in terms of trying to like just give you some perspective, right? I think a lot of us try to just conform our standards of who is a good judge by looking at like perhaps seniors in the circuit, seniors in the DepSoc, or perhaps senior individuals within the circuit whom we have judged with, okay, in terms of panel delibs and being like, if they had a thought in this way, or if they had a justification of a call in this way, that may be the right way to judge. But that's not necessarily the case because as we know, debating is an art. It's not a science. There is no objective reality. There are subjective interpretations of how you would go ahead and like evaluate the sort of rules that exist and the parameters that exist. What do I mean? This is a lot of fluff. So there are a bunch of underlying principles and there are a bunch of concepts that we need to understand. Okay, so the stuff that is present in the WDC manual, in terms of like the rules of BP debating, in terms of the rules of like say debate in general, like irrespective of format, and the other sort of like say parameters that we set across in terms of like defining like okay, here's what we exactly mean by what a contradiction is, or here's what we exactly mean is acceptable as a model or not. But these are definitions that are given, and we need to apply those definitions as per our subjective understanding of it. Okay, which means to say that it's not like, oh, you can just go ahead and like say make any like say random like interpretation. You should obviously stick to the reasonability of the interpretation. You should try to go ahead and like figure out your own specific reasoning from the underlying principles. Why is this important? This is important because two people like me and Ojas can have a different call, can have perfectly valid reasoning in terms of why we reached that different call. And this is something that is not uncommon. Splits happen all the time in like huge finals like WDC. Like all those judges are really good. Um, or even if you look at the HWS round robin, wherein like there have been two separate panels, and you do go ahead and see those two separate panels giving two different calls in this instance. So this means to say, if your reasoning is right, if your call is right, and if the way you try to explain it is right according to the principles that you've applied, it is a justified call. So there is not one objective or one like right call, as you may want to say. There is a call that you ascertain to the parameters and principles of debating that you ascertain to be right. Um, okay, and yeah, I think apart from that, just in terms of like note taking, what I'll just add on is note taking is a very personal thing, like Ojas very specifically pointed out. So it may be the case that you may feel that I just need to note down one or two words and I remember the entire argument. But I'll tell you the end goal of what this note taking should do for you. The end goal is you should be able to recollect the entire argument, and the parts of the argument, the rebuttal, the engagement, the weighing, everything else, when you're asked that in deliberation, or when you want to explain that in the OA, or when you want to talk to the teams in itself. So it does not really matter how much you really track, but it does matter what the end goal is. The reason why I'm telling you this is often we get confused. We're like, okay, O just told me I need to write down everything because I don't have a specifically good memory. Or somebody else told me that I need to write down words because that's more efficient for me. But I'm not really sure what should I necessarily stick to because I am confused in this whole process. Then try to see whether or not you're meeting the end goal. Like at the end of the delib, or at the end of like taking your notes, are you able to perfectly recollect all the arguments in the words the teams has specifically said? If yes, the amount of notes you're taking is sufficient. If not, then you would want to take more notes. And I think that's the parameter you can set up to. Um, Cool. So apart from that, I think this Pratham has a question in terms of how do we track replies? This is different from any normal speech. I would say it's the exact same thing, right? In the sense that tracking in itself would just be tracking the individual components. So if you're tracking an argument, you'd be like argument title, um, the burdens of the argument as explained by the specific speaker, within those specific burdens doing those piece of analysis. Okay, there are three reasons that like one team provides in terms of why this holds true, or why this problem exists, or why is there a solvency for it, and then you just note down all those three reasons in like a clear format, something that is comprehensible to you. In terms of replies, also the same thing. Like they'll be like, okay, we feel this is the strategic observation. So you note it as strategic observation one. You note if there's a rebuttal that is being presented to a previous argument. And I think that's why numerics are always helpful. Like try to number the arguments, be like, okay, OG argument one, OG argument two. Then when you're writing for OO, you can be like, okay, OO presents rebuttal to argument one of OG. So you can like have a shorthand. Like I would do like R1 or R2 to just indicate like if they're rebutting this first argument of OG, or what specific part of the argument they're rebutting, and what is the specific conclusion. So yeah, this should just necessarily be the same for reply speeches. Um, are there any other questions on this before I just move on? Yes, Aditya.
Um, how much do you insert yourself into the debate? It is not. I just want to be specific about it. For example, OG has a particular view, and O mention some intuitive rebuttal to this, but they never go ahead and weaponize their intuitive claim or argument against OG's specific mech. Insofar that doesn't exist, how do you then weigh both of these arguments? Do you go ahead and insert yourself and say that OG's mech can be broken? Insofar you understand as a like rational person that it can be done.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. So that's what I will be explaining right now in this specific, like I don't know, slide that you would call weighing and coming to the right call. So I think the essential thing is this: there are two parts of it. The first part is essentially going ahead and crediting material. So what do we have right now? Let's reset our minds. Let's reset our like heads back to the process. We were taking notes, we have written notes, and there is notes on our paper in terms of what the arguments are, what the rebuttals are, what the engagement is, what the weighing is. So whatever the teams have said, I have written it down. Also, additionally, I've written down some comments that I would use perhaps to determine this weighing and coming to the right call. But this is something I'll explain a bit more further while I'm explaining this. Okay, so let's assume we have all of this. Now, what do we do? The first thing to do, and this starts chronologically. My bad. The first thing you want to do is resolve the opening half clash. Okay, so as we're hearing PM, as we're hearing LO, PM, LO, then LO responds to PM. There's an engagement. There's a one-on-one clash that has happened, and then after that you have DPM and you have DLO. After DLO is done, what you would essentially want to do is have an offhand understanding of who is winning the opening half, and that is specifically even when you're perhaps even when you're watching the debate in itself and you haven't perhaps completed your entire tracking sheet or completed like the specific sets of weighings that you would want to say in your OA or say in Deleb. This is something I can do later on when I'm perhaps thinking of it in the 2 or 3 minutes that my my chair has given me to go ahead, or my like panelists have asked me to go ahead and like review my notes. Okay, so what I'll try to do is I'll be like, this is a claim, the argument that is being made by side government. Okay, this argument has specific burdens. Okay, for the argument to hold. What do I mean by burdens? Burdens are just like any components within the argument. If they hold true, then the argument holds true. Let's take an example. Okay, Ojas, can you just quickly give me a motion, because I think it'll be better to illustrate this.
This house regrets the glorification of soldiers.
Wow. Okay, this house regrets the glorification of soldiers. Um, okay, let's make it more interactive. Okay. Can any of you guys like perhaps provide me with a claim that side government would provide in this debate? Just like an argument. Like, what do you think would be an argument? You don't need to explain the whole thing, but you can just be the like speak out the idea. Who wants to go ahead? Yes, Suganya, go for it.
Maybe glorification of violence and destruction of peace on a larger extent.
Glorification of violence. So your essential idea is when we glorify soldiers, we glorify the violence that is being committed by them.
Yeah, in the present context, kind of.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think there are stronger claims that we can make from like perhaps using that idea. Does anyone want to be more specific than that? Yeah, or just if no one else is feeding in, go for it. Oh yeah,
Um,
we have people. Yes, Gokul, go ahead.
Okay, I feel if the glorification of soldiers happen, then like the wrong things that they do, like probably the custodial torches that happen in areas where where they do the surveillance in, like those might go unnoticed as to when in the alternative if it isn't as glorified as it is now.
Okay, so you're saying the misdeeds that are being committed by soldiers in itself get normalized, or we brush past aside it, or we don't really focus on them because we are glorifying a set of soldiers, right? If I get this correctly?
Yeah,
Okay, so this also adds on to Sukanna's idea of violence. Yes, Pratap?
It's the idea of when you see someone as a hero, there is the other person is the villain, right? So basically, you'll go on to hate Muslims, etc., like that, as an
Okay.
Indian, basically.
Okay. And Ashi, yeah, like we'll just take the last one and then we'll just wrap this up.
Okay, so like I'm not sure if it holds or not, but again, I thought that like this can be one of the things that we know that soldiers when they are performing their duty, they are being paid for it. It's not that so basically glorifying it in a sense that because obviously they are being paid for whatever they are doing, right? They are like on the borders and they are being paid for it. It's not that like they are working free of cost. So yeah, right. Oh.
Cool. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So let's take this claim, and I'll write this claim on the chat itself. So the glorification of soldiers normalizes, or wait, let's phrase this a bit more succinctly. Okay, it yeah. Just give me a sec. I'll just write it on the chat.
You want to just frame it as accountability.
Yeah, evades accountability, something of that sort, or perhaps normalizes like bad actions. Um, how do you want to face this, Ojas?
Uh, Reduced accountability would be what would go down
Yeah,
my note.
yeah, yeah. Cool. So the claim is glorification of soldiers reduces accountability on them. Okay, so this is the heading of our claim. Okay, and uh, perhaps all what you guys have said, right? When I hear this, this is what I would perhaps want to note down. I mean, obviously it depends on like what has been said and what has not been said, but if you do use these words in terms of, oh, it helps them escape accountability, oh, it helps them like go ahead and ensure that their bad deeds or their misdeeds are something that are not taken in focus. So if you have all of these sort of ideas present and this implies this would be the claim that you would want to note down. Glorification of soldiers reduces accountability on them. What are the burdens that would exist for this argument? And this is something that I need to think even if the team is not providing me those burdens. So let's look at the easy burdens. The first burden would just be, what does the glorification of soldiers look like, and how does this go ahead and like say like portray soldiers in itself? So that's like it's a definitional burden or it's a characterization burden. The second burden would just be specifically in terms of how does this go ahead and evade accountability or evade like standards of accountability that would be present in status quo. You can break this into two halves. You can talk about what are the ways in which you would hold government structures, or what are the ways in which you would hold structures accountable in general. And second, just go ahead and explain how the glorification in itself that you have proved to the first burden then goes ahead and evades this. Okay, so specifically we have identified three burdens that exist within this argument in itself. So for me to go ahead and give the team credit for this argument, I would have to see them fulfill these three burdens. Okay, and that's what answers the question of sorry, I forgot the person who asked the question in terms of how much should we credit or should we be interventionists. The simple answer is you should not be interventionist, but the thing that you should be assessing is there is a claim. For me to buy this claim or for me to credit this claim, I need specific burdens being fulfilled. Are these burdens being fulfilled by the speaker? If yes, I credit the claim. If not, I would want to go ahead and look at the specific logical gap or that specific thing that the speaker has missed in order to go ahead and like tell them that you didn't explain what glorification is, so I'm not really sure to how this evades accountability standards. Or secondarily, you didn't explain how these soldiers evade accountability, so I'm not really sure in terms of why this claim holds true. Um, if there are any questions on this, you can go ahead. Then I can just explain how to like go ahead and weigh this.
This is not a question. I just want to add like a little bit. I think the basic idea is that also related to that question. I think the golden rule is that you don't intervene. But the caveat there is assessing whether an argument is proved or not is not an intervention, which is
Yeah.
the stuff on burdens, right? That is, if somebody doesn't prove an argument, I won't credit it. And I don't need rebuttal to just consider an argument not proven. And an extreme example of this is perhaps someone comes and says that the BJP is a Muslim party, right? Um, they if they can't prove this, which I mean, practically it's impossible to prove this, right? I don't need the other team to come and say, but no, the BJP has a Hindutva agenda. I can, on my own as a judge, assess whether it is true or not, and I should actually do that, right? So, like, if you consider intervention, you should be doing that, but you
Yeah.
should not be doing intervening beyond that.
I think Ojas makes a very valid point over here because sometimes specifically, and this brings us to a very important example in terms of like normative or empirical claims that teams make that are just like they're just wrong from the standpoint of the ordinary intelligent voter. So an ordinary intelligent voter, again, just to recap people's memory, is someone who just follows the news, so they are aware of the international headlines. So if some event or something has hit the international headlines for a sustained period of time, they would be aware of it. An easy example would be this. So we know that like during the past few years, there have been a lot of cases wherein um, aging populations have been a major issue within the world. Okay, so there have been a lot of countries trying different strategies in order to go ahead and tackle the issue of aging populations. So we see China, who's repealed the one-child policy and have activated what we call the two-child policy. We've seen other sort of like Western countries like going ahead and incentivizing you to go ahead and have children by like providing you things like subsidies and providing you grants if you go ahead and do so. So these are things and these are ideas that would be known to the average reasonable voter or the OIV. What would not be known to the OIV is how do these policies actually work and what specific policies are being implemented by specific country and the results of this, because you're not supposed to know more than what the headlines perhaps tells you. So if someone comes and makes this claim that China does not have an aging population crisis, this is a claim that is empirically wrong. So even if the other team doesn't point it out, which is always good for the other team to point out, might I add over there, you should always go ahead and be like, um, I was not able to ascertain whether or not this claim is true or not, given I as an ordinary intelligent voter, I know this is empirically false. So this is a valid justification that you can provide, which means to say you're not giving them credit for a material that is like wrong from OIV's point of view. Okay. Anything else you want to cover on that, Ojas?
Nope, nope. I think
Yeah.
my only
Cool.
yeah, my only addition is that this doesn't just I would say that this is not just limited to fact claims, like it's not just limited to claims about
Hmm.
truth. I think you should apply this stress to all arguments, like regardless whether they're about truth or not. Like even if there's an analysis given of something, if
Hmm.
it's not adequately proven why that should be believed, I think it should be discredited.
So I would add a layer of like a layer of like precaution over there. Um, ESL, my bad. I was gonna say suspicion. Um, so the difference between a fact claim and say perhaps an analysis claim that is unproven and a fact claim that is untrue would be this: if a fact claim, like I've not proven the fact claim, I just state it. I have not fulfilled the burdens. I I give the team the credit for the for making the claim without fulfilling the burdens. Which means to say, if I have to compare the existence of the claim versus the existence of no claims, then that exists. But am I crediting them with actually creating change or going ahead and explaining why specifically that argument works or why specifically that impact works? That is not the case. And Ojas is very right to point it out over there that you shouldn't be like, oh, just because a team said that this might lead to nuclear war or this. And I think, with no offense, in a lot of instances, I've seen people do this. It's been like, okay, the team claims a very large burden, a team claims a very large impact, okay? And hence, like, we ought to see this impact to be more important than the small impact that the other team has claimed. No, that's not necessarily the case, because it depends on whether or not that big impact or that large impact that they claim has been proven, whether or not the burden specifically for the argument has been proven. And then you go ahead and assess material. So this is a good segue to go ahead and introduce weighing. Okay, uh, so now you have credited this argument. You have this claim. You know how much analysis the team has provided. You've marked out what are the burdens they've completed, what are the burdens they have not completed. You have assessed that, okay, if this is the analysis provided by the team, I am able to give them credit for X impact, or I'm able to know that there is an Y claim that they have made. Okay, now, I also do that for the opposition side. So they have another counter claim that exists, okay? And there's a bunch of rebuttal also. Let's assume like OO has done some rebuttal to OG. It has either mitigated the argument, or if it's taken it down totally, then OG's argument is not standing anymore. But let's assume that they have mitigated it and there is some material existing. So OG has an argument remaining at the end of opening half. O has an argument remaining at the end of opening half. So there are two competing claims that exist, and these two competing claims, let's assume, have different. Okay, let's not assume that. I'll go ahead and explain all the circumstances in terms of how you would weigh these two competing claims. Okay. The first thing, and this is the first cardinal rule that you see, is there an explicit metric that both the teams have agreed to is what they are trying to achieve through that specific piece of argument, okay? So if OG has said that this argument that we have, say, I don't know, improves access to healthcare, okay? And OO's end impact also is like this improves access to healthcare. We just look at, okay, which team has provided, like, say, better analysis in terms of going ahead and showing us where you get like improved access to healthcare. So this is what you would consider to be an example wherein both the teams have explicitly agreed to the metric, even though their arguments in the ways they achieve it are clashing with one another. Let's assume that that explicitness is not present, like both teams have not explicitly said that this leads to improvement in healthcare. The second heuristic that we apply over here is going ahead and like thinking and looking over the material and seeing, okay, what is the end goal of this argument, or what is the argument actually trying to say, or what are the conclusions of this impact in itself. And if it is pertaining to that same very clash or same very issue or same very principle, then I would essentially go ahead and say that that is the issue, or that is the clash that we feel is common between two teams. So is what we would call having an implicit agreement from both teams. Example, OG's argument has a bunch of impacts, and all those impacts lead to improvement in healthcare. O's argument have a bunch of impacts, and all those impacts lead to improvement in healthcare. So improvement in healthcare then becomes the metric on which I judge this interaction between both the teams. Let's assume that's not given. Let's assume that doesn't exist. Like, we don't know whether there's an explicitly agreed metric. We don't know whether there's an implicitly agreed metric. Then what do? We then go ahead and kind of identify, are there metrics that each team have provided? Have they proven those metrics to be important than one another, more important than one another? The very simple way to look at this is just look at it and say, is there explicit weighing that is done by either team in order to show why their metric is more important than the other metric that has been provided by the opposition team? And if that is the case, depending on the extent of the analysis, you go ahead and credit them for that specific clash and say, so the example would be very simple. Be like, OG wants to say that there's improvements in healthcare, okay? O wants to say there's improvements in science, or let's take something that is non-overlapping. in defense spending. Okay, and OG proves to us that spending in healthcare is more important than spending in healthcare in like defense spending. Then we shall assess that OG is able to prove that this metric is more important. Hence, OG should get the credit in terms of why the material in itself is something that is more important than the material that is present in opening opposition. I think this also serves with a bunch of caveats. The first caveat is either team may have weighing, in which case, if both teams have weighing, you have to assess again on a scale of relatives which team has the stronger weighing. The second caveat is obviously this involves you introspecting in terms of what is the extent to which the argument has been proven, which means to say for this to hold true, at a bare minimum, you should have all the burdens completed, even if that means that the analysis is not excellent. Which means to say that the Oshi argument, at worst, has to be complete for us to go ahead and ascertain that, like, they have weighed this metric more strongly than O, and hence we should give it credit for it. It doesn't need to be the most excellent of analysis, but at least needs to be proven for us to go ahead and give them credit for it. So these are just the basic caveats of this. I know this is a very long and tedious explanation of the third metric, but I would appreciate if you ask any questions on it. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
How do you manage to do all of this thinking in 2 minutes that you are given?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when I talk about the fourth metric as well, you'll realize that there's more to it. Like it's not only these three steps; there's a fourth step also to this, and these are fourth steps after you've assessed and credited the material. So the short answer is this: you need to be thinking more on your feet whilst you're note taking your arguments, whilst you're writing down, okay, here is the argument title, here are the pieces of analysis. You also at the same time need to be doing like, okay, this is a missing burden that I feel that the team itself has missed. And at the end of the speeches, perhaps make like side notes for yourself. Okay, the argument from OG is on this clash, the argument from OO is on, say, some other clash. And I think the thing is you just should like practice a lot more, because I think it's just to say that it's not easy. I do understand, especially when we are doing it first, and that's the reason why, like, the more we practice this, the better we become. So it's always good to start with AP judging if you're a novice, and then build your way to BP judging, because I think BP judging itself gives you less time, a bit more complex, bit more nuanced. And speaking also helps. When you're speaking, you're actively thinking, you're like, okay, I need to think of rebuttal to this argument. So you don't have time, right? You don't have time to take after your speech is done to actually write down the rebuttal. So you have to write down the rebuttal then and there. So in the process of thinking of rebuttal, right, you're having to both note take the argument and write the rebuttal, right? So what you're doing essentially is you're giving yourself more time in your head, and you're faster in terms of processing it both in your head and on paper or your laptop or whatever that is the case. Which means to say this improves your speed. The game has a lot to do with speed, and that's something you have to focus on. Does that half answer your question, Om?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I think
Sukanya. Yeah, no, sorry,
just
Ojas, you saying something?
yeah. I think it also comes down to tracking well. That is, if you do what we've talked about and you identify the claims and the burdens and the arguments while taking notes, I think that helps you a lot with crediting and weighing, because then you know exactly what you are weighing. It's much better to have these, like, I would say, structured notes, because they help you judge better. Like, it's a very direct outcome. If you're just writing down everything in paragraph form, you're not going to be able to weigh well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like structured notes, and that's why Ojas's first part on the note taking is supremely important. You cannot overemphasize how much like actually having it in a clear format, like dividing the A4 into two, having PM, having LO clearly, or whatever works. Maybe you take two different pages. I've seen people do that, like write PM on one page, write LO on the other page, till the point you're able to recollect all of that and like assess all of that well. I think it's great. Like, but I would say it may seem daunting at this point of time if you're like, okay, this is a lot of work, and maybe in like very high technical debates, it gets really messy. I would advise you not to be afraid of it, because I think it looks daunting, as would debating look daunting in terms of tracking people who speak very fast when you enter the activity. But as you do it more and more, as Ojas would have done like over hundreds of debates over and over again, is you get very proficient at it, okay? And you get very skillful at like, um, even if you're not actively thinking about what the burdens are, the burdens just appear in your head and you're writing it down. So it just reflects actions after a point of time. So don't worry, don't really take a lot of stress. Sukanya, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just asking that when the matrix you explained, how does it differ when we do the long diagonal or the short diagonal clash?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
basically, like,
I will explain that. Yeah, I'll explain that. I was just doing the opening half, right? So there are
okay,
three. Yeah, yeah. I'll come to that. There are three things that we did after we assessed material that I just said. The first thing is there an explicit metric both teams have agreed on? If yes, that is the metric. Second, is there an implicit agree? What is Ojas saying? Wait. Lot of yeah. Important comment. um Second is there an implicit metric, like are the arguments from both teams implicitly leading to a specific outcome or a specific goal that either team feels is important? Then that is the metric. The third thing is assessing, weighing, seeing that, okay, has the team on OG weighed their metric more importantly than the metric of OO, whether or not that is done better than the other team, and then deciding on the metric. Now let's assume that all these three things have not happened, okay? Like none of these three things are available to you. You don't see explicit weighing, you don't see implicit weighing, you don't see teams like weighing their metric against one another. Then you're like, what do we do? There are two competing claims, and this happens a lot, like in debating in general, because teams often, I mean, I would not say in general, but I think in a lot of rooms, in the mid tier level, where teams often make competing claims without having like done weighing for it. Um, you basically go ahead and you assess which metric is more important to the ordinary intelligent voter, okay? And I think to some you may feel that, oh, am I being interventionist over here? I guess to some extent, and it's a very small extent. But don't think of yourself as being interventionist, because you are not deciding whether or not one metric is more important than the other. You're applying the principles of what the OIV would know to assess whether one thing is more important than the other. What do I mean by this? The OIV has specific knowledge about the world, it's unbiased, whatever, yada, yada, yada. So, to the OIV, what do you think is a more important issue? Do you think healthcare is a more important issue? Or do you think defense spending is a more important issue? And I think often it also comes down to things like, okay, has one team analyzed their argument better than the other team has analyzed their argument, and such and so forth. So yeah, I mean, these are things that would come about, and this is how you would like go ahead and ascertain metrics and ascertain how you weigh OG against OO. Yes. Oh, go for it.
Okay. Unrelated question. So, hypothetically speaking, if a team is able to establish a frame that I can buy into, um, but the opposition has not bought into it, does that mean, and in that particular frame, um, the opposition arguments don't stand? Does that mean that nothing the opposition says is valid?
Wait, could you repeat that again?
So, for example, OG puts up a particular frame that I'm able to buy into. However, the
Right.
opposition does not buy into that frame. They try to challenge it, but their reasoning is not successful.
Hmm.
Um, so, do they? It's the do the arguments they make under their frame stand or not?
So I guess this is what you would pertain to definitions and models and characterization clashes and stuff like that, right? Um, So if OG has defined a motion in a specific way and you feel the definition is reasonable and you've given them credit for the arguments, and then O makes a definitional challenge, or O says that, I think OG is squirreling the motion in some way, they're not taking the full burden, and the challenge in itself is unsuccessful, doesn't necessarily mean you discredit all of O's arguments. You look at O's arguments, but you apply it with the frame or with the metric that OG has specified. Okay, um, which what do I mean by this? I essentially mean to say that um, the metric or the definition or the characterization that OG has specifically put out at this point of time is the thing that you would consider to be true and valid while you're evaluating the opening half clash. Does it make sense? Cool. So now let's go and introduce the closing teams into this round. And here's where PP judging gets a lot more interesting than that of AP judging. I've got the opening half. I figured out the clashes. Okay, there are two clashes. In these two clashes, I think OG wins one clash, OO wins one clash, OG proves one clash is more important than the other clash, and then OG wins the opening half. Let's just assume such a scenario has taken place. Now we have CG that comes into the debate, and now we have something that you would call extensions. So one, as Ojas very rightly pointed out, like you would go ahead and like note the extension very carefully. Again, I would like advise you to go and check the manual again if you're unclear about what constitutes an extension in itself. I would say that according to the new manual, there is a specific change that has happened when they've been like, okay, new mechanisms to existing arguments is also allowed in like whip and all of that. So like these are like some small tangible changes, but I don't really see that as like something that was very different from what was already existing. It used to happen. Judges used to give them credit for it. Excuse me. It just wasn't formalized within the words of the manual is what I'd claim over there. But again, Cat's video for more clarifications on what that entails. But now you have the extension. You're like, okay, here's the extension. And now let's weigh this against both OG and against OO. And let me be clear. I think this is a better way of approaching it, approaching the kind of comparisons rather than doing it like fourth to first. I mean, I do understand some people have, I mean, better understanding of that or are able to do it better, but I feel that something that's more standardized and something that is easier to explain, especially if you're a judge that is coming up, or irregardless of your experience, I think it's always good to be like, here's OG's case, here's OO's case, here's the opening half comparison. Let's introduce CG, let's weigh CG against OG, let's weigh CG against OO. So you're done with three comparisons, then you introduce closing op, then you do the closing op comparisons against the other three. This chronological format of, I mean, structuring your OA or structuring your thoughts whilst you're coming to the right call, I think is crucial in order to go ahead and like kind of understand the methodologies that you would follow. Again, caveat, if you feel that like fourth to first is a better way, I mean, for you specifically, that's totally up to you. Okay, so assuming there's some value to this method that Ojas and I very much follow. You know CG's extension, now you want to weigh this against OG. What is the thing that you're looking for? You're looking for whether or not the Gov team is like the CG is a better Gov team than OG, okay? And how do you ascertain this? There are a number of ways you ascertain this. The first thing is you look at the substantive material, the positive material that is being provided by CG, okay? And this may either be on a different clash or it may be on the already existing clash that OG has provided. Which means to say, or it may be on the same impact, which means to say either it may be a vertical extension or it may be a horizontal extension. I'm pretty sure like lectures in the previous few office hours videos and also other lectures have kind of covered this, but if you still feel unclear, like I could explain briefly on what that is. So now what you want to do is you want to apply these very 4 steps that I have explained in the opening half again to this very same thing. Be like, okay, do we feel that like both teams are targeting a same metric? If they're targeting a same metric, I would see whether or not they have done better analysis. Or do we see whether or not um, one team has proven their metric to be more important than the metric of the other team? If yes, then we are certain that that is something that is more important. Now, what is a tangible difference in this bench comparison? The difference is this: you do not have OG getting the ability to go and weigh their material against CG. OG can't go and like give a reply speech after that because that doesn't exist in BP debating. So why is it fair, might you ask? And it's fair because, well, it's in the rules of BP debating. But I think the more specific answer is this: CG is in the is in the unique position of making the weighing, but they cannot also provide material that has already been provided by OG, which means to say OG has a positional advantage over here. Sorry, just give me a second. Um, Ojas, can you just continue on this? I'll just be back in like 2 minutes.
Yep, just give me 1 second. I'm so sorry. I'll continue in like 30 seconds. I'm just doing something else. Give me a minute. Okay, I missed the last minute or so of what Rushdoon was saying. Um, if I'm right, and I was tracking correctly, he's talking about bench weighing within the same bench. I think he's already addressed how to assess positive material. I think the idea is, firstly, on assessing the same bench, you should be tracking everything. Let me turn my video on. You should be tracking everything closing bench does. And if you are of the opinion, and there's sort of two ways in which you bench weigh, right? The first is in terms of claims that are vertical extensions. I think this is what Rushdoon was talking about. Uh, you basically look at one, whether the outcome or the impact is the same. In that, if both teams have claimed X outcome, so that is, if both teams have said in a motion about, say, healthcare, that this will increase healthcare access for those in most need of it, right? One, you have to assess which team has been able to prove better on scale in terms of what team is able to show more people getting access. I think it is fairly easy to do by assessing or like utilizing the same metrics that the teams rely on. And I think Rushul's already talked about how to assess and determine metrics, so I won't go over that again. But essentially, on whatever metric that these teams are using to weigh this argument against other arguments, but also to prove the importance of this argument, you should probably assess which team meets this metric better, right? The second is just in terms of quality of proof, perhaps. And I think this is a bit more, uh, this is something that depends slightly more on how well you track again, right? In terms of quality of proof, what I will say is if an opening team is able to prove something or is able to prove, say, a claim. So if opening team is able to prove to me that healthcare access of the most vulnerable people increases significantly because of a certain policy, and they're able to prove that this increase actually happens, and they're able to prove a significant scale, a closing team to win over that opening team has to do one of two things, right? One, they have to show why they are doing this policy in a way which achieves significantly better or significantly larger outcomes in terms of either quality, that is better healthcare, or scale, that is much more people having access to healthcare. If the closing team proves the same thing with the same impact in a different way or using different mechanisms, it is unfortunately the case that in most cases, this closing team cannot place over their opening because what they have proven is already proven. Them proving it in a different way, unless that different way is able to meet certain burdens in terms of just probability or in terms of scale, unless they are able to differentiate why this different way they're proving this thing is better or should be believed
Or
more than what
just
opening
just
teams
just
have.
a small caveat on that. So you may have different mechanisms to reach the same end goal or same endpoint that OG is reaching, but if you can prove to us that those mechanisms are better mechanisms than that of OG, like they are either more efficient mechanisms or like they're reaching the end goal faster or they are stronger mechanisms. So the goal is to prove that either you have stronger arguments or stronger mechanisms to reach the same impact or stronger impacts. And when I mean stronger, you just can't just claim it's stronger. You have to explain and prove to us as to how that is stronger. And that is something you need to look out for in what teams are specifically doing. Sorry, go ahead, Ojas.
Same thing. And again, Arif, you have a doubt.
Yeah, so stronger as in does that mean the probability will be more, or is it like within the debate, the meta debating wise, it's a stronger mech?
Right. So I think to assess strength, you can apply a bunch of metrics, right? Your first fallback should be whatever metric a team has claimed an argument to be important on. So an argument would be stronger if it attains the same goal as another team's, but does it in a way that is A, either more believable, or B, just more true for empirical reasons, or is just objectively something that is. So, for example, if opening government says more people will have access to healthcare now because it is cheaper, but never explains why this reduction in cost either occurs or is significant enough to actually affect the people's ability to access medicine, right? A closing team can come in and give me the mechanism for why this reduction in cost is actually going to be significant in that it's actually increasing access. So this is how it would be stronger. So probability of the outcome could be the same, but the way in which this outcome is reached could be proven in a more comprehensive manner, right? So that's sort of what you would mean by a stronger argument.
And
I don't
strength
know.
is also what you would like identify through weighing that is being provided by the
Yeah.
teams. And I mean, obviously, the way you would apply the principles of, I mean, what we've just spoken about in terms of the four steps that you would assert in terms of go ahead and seeing whether or not the weighing is explicit, implicit, and yada yada.
I think another way in which you assess strength is probably where it's not the same claim or outcome, where these are just two different arguments that you're
Hmm.
assessing. A way to assess strength is probably relevance to the motion, in that even if something is extremely well proven but doesn't actually address the basic motions of the debate, it can't be stronger than an argument which is slightly less proven but much more relevant. So if in a debate like this house regrets the glorification of soldiers, if closing government gives me extensive reasons for why the glorification of soldiers will lead to worse uniforms for soldiers, I don't necessarily know why that's important or relevant to the debate, and therefore it is by nature a weaker argument. So strength isn't exclusively a factor of how well you prove the claim. It's also a factor of how relevant or important the claim itself is. I think Vishnu, you can take back over.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm,
yeah.
I'm
And I mean, I think that that's a very important idea, because then you go ahead and the goal of any argument, the goal of analysis is to go and show it's true and important, right? Like if you're making a claim, I want to uh, prove the claim. I want to say that the claim is true and the claim is important in those specific orders, or like whatever order you may choose. So even in this instance, right, when I'm doing my weighing, as Otis very rightly pointed out, I may have like a very different mech and a different argument in CG, and I may even make an explicit weighing. I may be like, my argument is more important than that of opening gov because of these specific reasons. But if that argument in itself is not relevant to the motion, if this argument in itself has issues that, like, say, the ordinary intelligent voter would be able to assess, then these are important reasons that would also be considered in terms of looking at how persuasive or how complete or how true the weighing essentially is. So yeah, this is just in terms of the the vertical clashes. Yeah, it's vertical clashes. Let's look at diagonal clashes. Like, say you have opening government with, sorry, opening government, closing opposition, closing government, opening opposition. So what do? I mean, I think it's pretty similar to that of like the same bench in itself. Like, not is same bench like OGO. What would you call it? Um,
same half,
the
same half.
same half, same half. Yeah, yeah, that's the right way. Um, it's very similar in that way, in the sense that you would look at the clashes that exist between both the teams and then you would assess the material based on it. The only caveat that you perhaps have, and maybe you can check this out with the judge manual as well, is the idea on POI interactions. And given the fact that CG is coming after opening opposition, and CO is coming after opening government, um, if you have two competing claims that are present against each other, and the weighing is incomplete, and like neither team has weighed their metric or their argument to be more important than one another, and there is very little to differentiate amongst them, the answers to the POIs, or the fact of whether or not you have taken POIs, comes into consideration in terms of flipping the call, or going ahead and awarding CG more speaker points, or going ahead and giving them credit, which means to say you should track POIs as importantly as you would track arguments, or as you would track like responses to arguments. You should track who is offering the POI being offered by member of government, or POI being offered by leader of opposition. Write the question of the POI and write the answer to the POI as well. Really important. Sometimes it may feel inconsequential, but I think you should still be noting these things down. Um, yeah, I think that should be all in terms of weighing and coming to the right call. There's a bunch of processes that you need to do, that you have time within the debate, but you also have 2 to 3 minutes after it. The more you practice, the better you get better at it. Do we have
I
any
just
broad questions on this? Yeah, I'll just go for it.
Yeah, I have one thing to add. So I think an important factor in doing diagonal comparisons is just, especially assessing responses from the closing bench, is to an extent to assess how novel that response is. And this comes as an aspect of your vertical weighing already, right? So when you're doing your OGO or OGCG, if you're able to see that the response from CG is significantly identical or relies on the same flaw in the same way as OG does, that response cannot be credited significantly just because one, it's derivative, but also two, usually O has no chance to respond to it, right? That's also perhaps a consideration. Should not be your primary consideration. That is, if O has already had chance to respond to that argument and not done it, they should perhaps continue to be penalized for it. But you should be mindful that you aren't doubly penalizing an opening bench for something that they have no say in, and you aren't doubly rewarding a closing bench for just repeating what their opening said, right? So that's just something to be mindful of while doing diagonals as well.
Yeah, I think it just reminds me of another very important point that I kind of forgot to mention was when you're doing these vertical comparisons, you also need to consider the other elements of the extension that are not specifically the constructive material, that is also the destructive material. So if you feel that like, okay, so here's the case. Um, let's assume, okay, since I said OG is beating O, let's assume OG is beating O, and then CO has this extension, okay? CO's extension can merely be an extension on the basis of rebutting OG. Like it is doing nothing. There's no positive material. It is just doing rebuttal, right? But if we feel that the rebuttal in itself is a flip, i.e., it beats opening government, okay? Because the only way in which a rebuttal can beat the other team just on a destructive basis, like I am I am not making any new constructives, I'm just bringing in a rebuttal, is a flip, in which case you not really go out and explain why the other team's material is false or does not hold. You also go and explain why comparatively your side is better, and why comparatively your side is achieving the burdens or achieving the goals of the motion in a better way. Only in that instance would we see that the credit that is given to the rebuttal is more than the credit that's given to the constructive. Um, but also there are other scenarios, a scenario in which there's both constructive and destructive material. So it may be the case, I may be like, okay, I think CO beats OG, no, sorry, I think CO beats OO because I think the constructive material from both teams are kind of similar in terms of impacts, and the level of impacts and the quality of impacts that is being provided either team. I don't really see either team doing enough to go ahead and explain why one metric is more important than the other. But I feel CO has better rebuttal than 2OG. So by virtue of CO beating OG more comprehensively, I can ascertain and I can deduce that CO is beating O. So in this is how my reasoning would go when I will explain in the OA. I'll be like, O presents this clash X, great material. CO presents this clash Y, great material. I think the extent of the analysis, the extent of the impacts are similar on both extents. There's not enough there's no weighing, or there's not enough weighing to ascertain whether or not one is more important than the other. But CO has better rebuttal to OG, and by virtue of that better rebuttal, they are beating OG more comprehensively than OO is beating OG, and by virtue of that, CO is beating O. Notice this can't happen for CG, of course, because like you can't be like, CO is beating OO because CO had better rebuttal to like CG, because obviously OO didn't have the chance to respond to OG in that sense. Um, yeah, is there a question? Yeah. Exactly. It's a valid extension. Cool.
My
Let's move
my
on to the
last
next. Hmm.
Sorry, but my last bit of stuff here in terms of again the diagonals is that just because CG loses to OG, so in the instance where CG loses to OG, it's not necessarily true that CG must also lose. That wait, what am I saying? Yeah. So just because CG loses to OG because they're derivative, it's not necessarily true, or derivative, or they don't weigh adequately against their opening. It's not true that CG must also lose to OO. It's possible that where the same impact is given but proven in different ways, without these different ways being proven to be important, CG loses to OG. But they would still beat opening opposition by just virtue of having an extension that is a new way to reach the same impact or new mechanisms on that front. And that's something that a judge has to weigh out. I think that's all I had to say.
Yeah, cool. Let's move on to the next thing, Ojas.
Yeah, cool. The next bit, and we'll rush over this really quickly, is just deliberations and how to do it. I have a couple of pointers in terms of deliberations in general, which are sort of role agnostic in that they don't rely on whether you're a chair or a panelist. I think, regardless of what role you play in a deliberation, it's important for you to keep in mind that the object of the deliberation is not to get a score. I mean, of course, for you in a competition, it is to get us like to do well and get a break or whatever else. But the purpose which deliberation exists is to establish the outcome of the debate and to award the debate to the correct person, right? And for which it's extremely important that deliberations in general are rigorous and deliberations in general discuss and do adequate justice to every argument made by every team. So even if you personally think an argument is bad and unproven or whatever else, it's still important for posterity as well as to make sure that it's not just getting swept under the rug to address it. Because plenty of times where I've been a panelist or where I've been a chair, there have been arguments that somebody on the panel thought were irrelevant, but which somebody else thought were important. And in those cases, it's important to weigh it out and important to discuss it. And this applies regardless of whether you're a chair or a panelist. So if you're a panelist and you think your chair is asking you a question, an argument which is stupid, it still makes sense to discuss that because that might continue to be something that's important to the debate, right? And that just in terms of approach, the approach in a deliberation should not be about you as a judge, but it should be more about the debate and the teams. And this is a bit controversial, but it's because I maintain that debating is about debaters and not about judges. That I think you should keep that in mind and you should be mindful that the outcome you're seeking is to have the correct result of the debate, right? That's my disclaimer, and that's my advice, regardless of whether you're a
I'll just
chair or
add on to what Ojas has said over here. I'm being like having been in a lot of these discussions. I think Ojas will also agree with me. No one cares like how much you know about the debate. Like literally, no one cares whether or not you've tracked everything and have made all these comparisons in your head. Okay, what we do care about in a deliberation is reaching the consensus call. That is the goal of the deliberation. Like the chair is not taking a test. We are not quizzing you on like, oh, whether or not you know OG is beating O and CG is beating CO and like what are the specifics of it. The thing that we want to understand is we assume that everyone has an understanding of all these comparisons, and then we're like, okay, both of us have a vote, or maybe the trainee even doesn't have a vote, but like they're obviously a part of the deliberation in itself. All of us are treated equally. Can we reach a consensus call? Can we agree on one call to be the mutually decided one? Okay, so that is the goal of it. So when I'm being like, okay, can you quickly explain what you feel is the comparison between CG and CO? perhaps in like 30 seconds or like depends on what the chair asks you, obviously. Try to be as brief and precise as possible. Be like, um, CG's extension is on this line of reasoning, or this is the most important thing that we get from CG, this is the most important thing that we get from CO, and this is the reason why I believe CG beats CO. It may not be the entire weighing, it may not be the entire thing. You can state it with a caveat saying that, hey, I feel this is the most important thing, but if you want me to expand, I can expand. And I think there's a beautiful document on this that Enting and another very good
It's in chat.
debater,
The link is in
yeah,
chat.
yeah, the link is in chat, that had written, I think Enting and Claudia, if I
Yeah,
remember
I think
correctly.
it's NT and Claudia before
Yes,
you.
yes. So Enting and Claudia, by the way, much like Ojas and I have been career judges all their life, obviously with relative degrees of speaking success, relative degrees meaning Enting reached an HWS final. But so I think these people have laid down like a very concrete guideline in terms of what you should think about, what is the psychology and the process when you are entering deliberations. Even if you're a chair, your job is not to be like, oh, I know this amount of stuff. It's to be like, can we come to an agreed call? And the second thing is, can we discuss all the comparisons briefly? Like, in the sense that you don't need to do that, you don't need to discuss all the six comparisons. But in specific instances, when there is a close call, if I feel that OG and O is a bit close, I give them a 1 point win. It's worth discussing that if I have the time. But I think the most important thing, coming to the right call in the right amount of time. Yes,
I
Ojas.
agree. So that's just it in terms of just like the broad idea of deliberation. I think it's important to make sure that everything that happens in the debate gets addressed. And I think it's important that you as a panelist cooperate with your chair when they ask you for things. But it's also important that you as a chair don't discard cases just because you think they're relevant. Your panelists may disagree, and your panelists aren't like stupid. They're judging this. Like nobody's so immensely stupid they think things without any rhyme or reason, right? So always it's important to hear out other people on panel, and it's important to approach it in such a way that you're trying to understand where other panelists are coming from, because you aren't God. You don't like what comes out of your mouth isn't the gospel
Yeah.
truth. Like just like keep in mind that you're human and that you can make mistakes. I'll just skip to the next part because
Yeah, no,
we already
Ojas,
started
so
very long
just on this, I think it's a very important idea. So it's important to be assertive. It's important to have control over your panel, right? But at the same time, it is also important to not push people and like take away space. Okay, what do I mean by this? You shouldn't be a bully. You are not the best judge. Okay, fine, even if you're the best judge, like let's assume you are the best judge on planet ever. You are in a panel, and those panelists have a voice, and those panelists have a vote, and even if they don't have a vote, even if they're trainee, their opinions are valid, which means to say the call and the OA that you will be providing is not your own, it is the panels. Okay, and that is a very very important distinction to keep in your head, which means to say, oh, it's not my way or the highway, it is our way, and trying to understand what the perspectives of the other people are and incorporating that within your OA, even if you disagree with that, even if you feel it's absolute garbage. Okay, like I shouldn't use this word. It's a bit extreme, but if you feel it's unreasonable, okay, um, yeah, my apologies, Rohan, if you can edit that out. um, you should reflect that opinion within the call in itself. Yes.
Yeah. So my take on how to be a useful panelist is, I think, fairly simple, right? And for a more detailed discussion on this, I've dropped the link to the document that Rushdoon referred to in chat. The idea is, as a panelist, you have two roles. One, you have to ensure that that there is an adequate discussion on the debate that happened, and for this, it's important that you only talk about the debate that happened. Like even when you're judging and weighing, you only talk about the debate that happened, not the debate that should have happened, not the debate that you wish had happened, not the debate that one of the teams claimed happened just because they claimed it, right? So this is where taking comprehensive notes is important. It's important that you are able to have a meaningful and accurate recollection of the debate so you can meaningfully and accurately contribute to the discussion. So, how to be a useful panelist? The TLDR is just deep. precise, and be comprehensive. I know these sound like sort of like sounds like a paradoxical combination when I'm asking you to be both precise and comprehensive. But the way to go about this is simple, right? When you're taking your notes, you have to, as we've already talked about, be clear on the separation between claims, the analysis for those claims, and the impacts of those claims, right? When your chair asks you, hey, can you compare these two teams? The idea is you should not be completely recounting every single thing a team said and every single argument they made in full detail. Rather, it's more useful to say that team A argued X outcome and they gave me reasons A, B, and C for that. And these should not be like the full 7 minute speech reasons. They should be like brief pointers that you've made. And again, this is something that you develop with intuition with regard to which of these pointers are important and which are not. And then you compare those very directly with what the other team's claims are. And in brief, like talk about whatever metric you've applied the way one over the other, right? So when you're asked to compare a pair that is OG suppose, what you need to do is one, what like in very brief OG argument, in very brief O argument, and this is just the headlines of those arguments. Thirdly, what your metric was and why one team or the other wins on that metric, right? And this metric can be just something that teams don't talk about, but you have to explain why that is the metric, right? If you're asked to elaborate, you can, but the idea is you should be very, very brief to the extent that is possible because ideally 15-minute delivery, right? But also because other people can get a chance. What I would say is important is that you have to be assertive in that you should probably probably shouldn't sound like you're asking the chair a question when you're answering something they've asked. It also shouldn't be hand wavy in that you're saying, oh, team A ne bola ki this will happen. Team B ne bola ki this will happen. I think A is more likely to happen, which is why I think A wins. The idea is this debate is not about like the way a debate is going to come out or going to be decided is not based on what you think, but rather on the principles of judging and on the principles of debate and what happened there. So it's not your personal thoughts that matter most. Of course, your personal thoughts are important because they inform how you apply these principles, but you have to stick to those basic principles that are outlined in the manual and whatnot, right? So I would recommend highly, highly, again, be very, very conversant in the manual. That's the first thing. The second is if you think that what you're being asked to talk about is irrelevant, or you think the chair is just wasting time on something irrelevant, I would say still you have to probably answer that question. So if you asked OGO, but you really think that OGCG is the more important clash, perhaps you can mention that I think OGCG needs much more discussion, and then you can continue to do OGO, right? This is probably because the chair probably has a certain idea of what they want deliberation to look like, and they probably have a certain way in which they want to do its comparisons. It's best to sort of adhere to that or sort of defer to that to the extent as possible. Of course, if your chair is spending 15 minutes on OGO without ever talking about back half, at that point, it probably makes sense to farm, not 15, like if it's been 8 minutes of delivery and you're still on the first comparison, maybe it makes sense to mention that other comparisons need to be talked about. But to the greatest extent possible, just do what your chair asks of you, right? And also, like, it's important once that first basic round of comparisons is done. So you've done OGO, you've done OGCG, whatever else. Whether where it's a little bit less regulated, where there's more scope for you to reply and respond or interact with other panelists, that you actually do that. So it shouldn't be that the chair has to call on you multiple times to get you to speak. You should be assertive and you should probably contribute what your reading of the debate was, right? That's just it in terms of how to be a useful panelist. TLDR is say what you think based on the rules of debate and your tracking of the debate. Actually say things like think about this. You've been made a panelist for a reason. If you were just going to sit quietly for 15 minutes, why even be there? Like you're there to judge. So contribute in that way. Yes, your opinion has value, and like just beyond just like the like feel good idea of everyone's opinion is important because they have right to speak. It's because different people approach debate in different ways and different have different perspectives, and these different perspectives can and should inform the outcome of a debate, right? So it should contribute, and in my experience, based on what I score people and how I score people, I have very often scored people, panelists who disagree with me but are very active in deliberation. They do well when I score them. And this is something I've seen consistently, right? There are very few chairs who are going to shit mark you just because, sorry, who are going to like mark you badly because you disagree with them. As long as you're constructively contributing to the discussion, it's perfectly fine to disagree, right? And as a chair, you can always tell when somebody's just like going with your call because they want a good score. It's very, very transparent. because they don't actually believe it, and they don't actually believe it, they can't justify it. Like it's very hard to justify a call which you don't believe at all, right? So be transparent, stick to your call in terms of explaining it, and be willing to flip and discuss. That's just it in terms of how to be a good panelist. Yeah, Arif, what's up? Good.
So if the call is really, really close in your mind and the judge proves to you how it's possible to see it the other way, you still don't see it. So should you flip or should you stick to it?
If you're convinced, you flip. If you're not, you stick to it. Like it's just that, right? You should not, just because everybody. So you can ask, like I'm a career dissenter, and I've dissented in like 8 finals at this point. The idea is, just because everybody else on the panel thinks that call A is correct, that doesn't mean you should do. You should actually be convinced. But there is probably a cutoff point where a good chair, or even you as a good panelist, should point out that this discussion has gone on for too long, and other comparisons probably should be discussed too. And at that point, you as a panelist should like disagree but move on. Like the chair should call a vote, and you should put it to vote, and your dissent will be recorded and mentioned in the OA. But that will be that, right? But you don't should not feel pressured into agreeing just because Baki sab bol rahe, or like just because everybody else sees it very clearly a different way. So that's just my take on it. If you're convinced, you flip. If not, just stick with what you have, right?
Yeah, but this is just say, just don't be like stubborn for the like the case of like being like um, my way is the right way of looking at the debate, and I shall not be persuaded by logic. Be open to it. Like it's not like the TLDR is don't be a pushover, but stand your own ground, but also be willing to be persuaded by logic, as you would be in a debate when a team makes an argument to you. So the judge, by means of their justification, is making an argument to you that they're telling you, here's my argument for why OG beats O. If that argument is convincing enough, if that argument responds to all the kinds of reservations you have or the reasons you have in terms of why you looked at it the other way, be willing to be like, yes, I feel I look at it, I understand your perspective and I agree with your perspective and I'm willing to give it the other side. If you feel that, okay, I understand your perspective, but I still feel that my reservations have not been answered, and like I still have like some reasons why I feel that the other team is winning, and that's strong on my behalf, then be willing to like stick to your call and say that if the teams want feedback later, I'm most willing to like give them feedback in terms of why I looked at it the other way. We can
I
move on
think
to
it's
the
all.
next one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, before I move on to check, I think it's important to address that there is very rarely like an objectively correct call in most debates. That is just because of how judging is to an extent a subjective activity, because we aren't robots, and because well, it's the sport is centered on convincing people, and different people are convinced by different things. The same debate can go differently with different panels. Shouldn't, but can, because it's a human activity, and can go differently for the same judge on different days, right? Nobody has a perfect strike rate. There is not one judge in this world who can tell you that they have had the right call in every single round they've been in. And if there is, they're lying to you. Um, so even if you have the wrong call, or what the rest of the panel sees as the wrong call, there is no shame in that. And it's perfectly fine to be wrong. It's just that you shouldn't be wrong and annoying about it. Like you shouldn't be wrong and unwilling to change. And you shouldn't be wrong and arrogant about that wrongness. It's just the TLDR on this as well. Yes, be fair, be just, and try your best. Correct. Cool. How to be a good chair? I think this draws very directly, and I think the responsibility of a chair is important in that the job of the chair is to ensure, firstly, that the debate gets discussed as it happened, and two, the debate is done justice and everything is discussed. Personally, when I chair rounds, I like to address all 6 comparisons directly. This is something I've picked up from lots of experienced judges that I've judged with. So even if a comparison is very clear, so for example, if OG is speaking 85s and CG is speaking 60s or whatever else, I think it still makes sense for the purpose of posterity, as well as to make sure that like everyone has had a fair chance to discuss what's happened in debate, to pick that up. You don't perhaps spend 7 minutes on a clash that's obvious, but you also don't just skip a clash because it's so obvious, right? It still bears discussion. It's still important to discuss because other people might have contributions in terms of what made it clear for them that you can mention in poem. So that's my first thing. ensure you address all the clashes, even if not directly, at least implicitly ensure that all the comparisons are discussed and every team's contribution is assessed, right? The second thing is that as a chair, it's your responsibility to make sure that debates, that the deliberation stays on track. So just like it's the role of the panelists to make sure that they discuss their assessment and reading of the debate fully, it's your job to make sure that this doesn't go overboard, and yours, like, effectively you're the adult in the room, right? Like, the idea is you have to be able to sort of rein in this discussion and direct it in a manner that is productive. So you should not be lax, and you should not, even if you think personally that something is very interesting and you disagree with your panelists, and it's been a bunch of time you've been discussing the same thing, you have to be the adult in the room and acknowledge that this debate needs to be resolved and this call needs to be made, which is when you call for a vote, right? Chairing is not about your personal ego. You should not, like, be in the mindset that if I am the chair, my call is right, which don't address this very correctly. So even if you are the chair and there is a irreconcilable difference on your panel, at some point, and often that point is, in my opinion, like 5 minutes in for any given clash, you should call a vote. Unless, of course, it's a very consequential round or it's an extremely close call with like four different panelists having four different opinions. These are fringe cases, but in most debates where a significant amount of time has been spent on a topic, rein it in, call a vote, and move on. I think it's important to have some sort of conclusiveness in a deliberation, and it's your role as a chair to make sure that happens, right? That's one. Secondly, it's your role as a chair to ensure that everyone gets a chance to speak. And my take on this is that you have to offer everyone the equality of opportunity. That is, you have to allow everyone a chance to speak. But this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to guarantee that everyone gets to speak. What does this mean, right? If a panelist is not willing to speak, I don't think it's your responsibility as a chair to continuously call on them. But at the same time, if a panelist is speaking constantly or speaking over other people, it is your job to ensure that such a panelist isn't able to sort of suppress other panelists' views, right? Or isn't able to just hijack the conversation, because you are in charge of that discussion and you have to act in that manner. Um, Lastly, on how to be a good chair, I think the idea is you have to keep in mind that what you're going to do next after this call is given oral adjudication. And you have to ensure that everything that you need to address in that oral adjudication is addressed in this deliberation. It should not be the case that something that is important to the debate or could be important to the debate just goes undiscussed in your deliberation, for which you have to be very conscious, right? And you have to be very clear on what is being discussed, and which that also helps to address all the comparisons. Lastly, on how to be a good chair, this is in the round itself, so not while judging. I think it's just generally good as a chair to be respectful. It's good to be sort of generally nice to people, and it's good, most importantly, to ensure that certain like basic rules of decorum are maintained in the room. That is, you don't like you should not encourage or act in a way that shows preference. So even if your friend is on CG, you should not be chatting with them while other people are speaking. You should not be cracking jokes with them, or you should not perhaps be sort of clearly showing favor to somebody. Because even if that favor doesn't actually exist and you're judging objectively, the perception of that can be quite discouraging to speakers. If I'm a novice speaker in a room with three other teams, out of which two teams are known to the judge and are chatting with the judge, that's extremely demoralizing. And it's your responsibility as a chair to make sure that you don't put a team in a position where they feel that there is bias against them. Because even if that bias doesn't exist, that perception of bias can be harmful to new speakers, right? So just be mindful of that. Don't show preference. This doesn't mean don't talk to your friends ever. It's just that in the round, be mindful of what you are doing and how what you're doing is perceived by people in the round. That's just my TLD on how to be a good chair. Rushdun, if you want to contribute, you can. If not, we move to it. Cool. How to give an over? I'll, again, this is something that's like tracking, right? It's quite individual in that I have seen the best judges in the world give OAs entirely differently, even though the rounds have been fairly similar. What do I mean by this, right? How you structure an OA is entirely dependent, much like your notes, on how you conceptualize the debate. And I think, in my experience, it is most the most utility you derive out of your notes is to help structure your OA. So if the debate makes more sense to you in your mind in a chronological manner, and that's how it's envisioned in your mind, that's how you compare it. So going from OG to CO, that's how you should give your OA. If it makes more sense to you in terms of just going from team that's first to team that's fourth, that's how you should address it. If it makes more sense to you going fourth to first, that's how you should address it. The idea is, like Rusdoon said in chat, to be clear. And you cannot be clear if the way you are giving OA does not match up with the way you're thinking about the debate. So the way you give OA should reflect how you thought about the debate and how you came to your conclusions. I started by going fourth to first. That's how I gave my first BPOS. After which I moved to going first to fourth, which is how I did OS for a while. After a point, I have naturally transitioned to doing OS chronologically from OG to CO, just because how I envision debates is in that process of changing. But also, I've realized that it makes more sense to go OG to CO for me personally, because it helps me set out clashes fairly clearly in that way, right? But different judges differ on this and do this differently. It's entirely fine to do it in any way, just as long as you are clear and you do justice to all the clashes. So just because I'm going OG to CO doesn't mean I leave out, say, OGCG clash or COC clash just because it doesn't fit into my chronological order. Right? The idea is you should address all the clashes. What order you address them in may change. So if you're doing first to fourth, it's perfectly fine to do, suppose OG wins, it's perfectly fine to do OG and why they win, but you have to compare them to all the other teams before moving on to whichever team comes second, right? The idea is, and this steps into the next part about what to cover, you should absolutely be making sure that all six clashes get discussed. And this is slightly different from the deliberation, where perhaps you would not spend a lot of time on a clash that's very close. Like an 85-60 clash, you would not spend like 5 minutes on in deliberation, right? But you should probably spend a minute or two on that in your OA, just to ensure the team that's taken the loss knows why they have taken the loss. Because the objective of the OA is not just to tell the teams the result. Because if it was just that, you would just put in the result on tab and that would be that, right? It's to help teams understand why that result has happened the way it's happened and why they have taken the loss that they have taken. And this is why your responsibility as chair is also important, right? It's important that you are able to show teams what they have done wrong and
I presume Ojas had a bad internet connection. Yeah, so I'll just continue on what you were just saying. Like, be very clear in your OA, be very structured, cover all the six comparisons. Very, very important because what you want to be doing is providing clarity to each of those teams. To tell them why specifically one team beat them or one team like lost to them and stuff like that. It is lesser important, I would say, in a strategy point of view, when you're structuring your way, or even like in a broad sense. um, for the team who's winning to like get more attention, I would say the team that has lost the debate or has taken a fourth, it is important to give them valuable perspective in terms of why the other teams have beaten them. This is not to say you will ignore the team that is winning in itself, and all comparisons in and of itself is comparative in nature. It's not specifically talking about just one team and the other team on an individual level, but rather in terms of how they interact with one another, how their material interacts with one another, and how you've specifically looked at the resolving of the clashes and resolving of the weighing of it. So the way you would want to kind of structure this would be like, okay, let's take Ojas's example, or what I was talking about a bit earlier in terms of opening half. Okay, no, sorry, chronological order. And how would you do it? Be like, okay, I think OG beats O. There are two broad, and this is how you would like start your OA colloquially in terms of the explanation of it. I feel the rank is 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, whatever. Let's explain chronologically. So my take is OG beats OO. There are two broad clashes in the opening half. Clash one. Under Clash 1, we see OG, and you obviously state the title of what Clash 1 is. Like, what is exactly Clash 1? Under which you say that OG has one argument, or OG has two arguments under this. Okay, so let's assume OG has one argument. OG has one argument under this. Here's what we credit from the argument. OO brings a response to that argument. We feel that response is good or that response is sufficiently mitigating, or the response flips, whatever. Just explain what the response does, or what the bunch of responses that O provide do to that argument, and then provide perhaps the response to the response that OG has already provided, and conclude. Be like, the conclusion from the clash one opening half is, here is what we're able to credit from OG's argument. Then you go on to, on the flip side, we feel O has also has one or two arguments on this clash, and then you go out and explain that. And once you're done with that, also in the same process, you be like, okay, we feel that in this specific clash, say OG beats O because, well, they're able to show as to why this is a stronger impact, or this is a stronger mechanism, or there's a stronger way, like weighing that they provide within the specific clash, and that's the reason why we award this clash to OG. Similarly, you do the same for similarly, you do the same for Clash 2 and whatever number of clashes. So you do Clash 1, Clash 2, you're done with both the clashes, then you be like, in conclusion, we feel that the opening half is won by OG because they're able to prove why Clash 1 is more important than Clash 2, or just go out and like explain that entire like metric in terms of like showing us as to why specifically the ways in which they have won the debate, or ways in which they have proven their clashes, is something that is more important, or is done better than the other team. So you need to be like, Clash 1, within Clash 1, arguments on either side, responses and weighing. Clash 2, or if there is a Clash 2 in itself, and then make a conclusion. Here are the set of reasons, here are the set of conclusions, and why one team beats the other. Then you bring in closing gov. Then you do the same thing. Be like, we feel closing gov brings in an extension. We feel the extension is a vertical extension, a horizontal extension, or is a rebuttal extension, or whatever, the characterization extension. We feel the extension does this specific thing that they do. Now let's compare this with that of OG. Let's look at in the opening against OG. Are they able to do a better job than OG? Are they able to win the clash more strongly? Are they able to prove their clash is more important? Here are the reasons why OG beats CG beats OG, or OG beats CG. And then you complete that, you move on to CG versus O, then you bring in CO, then you do the comparisons, so and such and so forth. So be very clear, write down within prep, and not prep, sorry, within like the delib, on what are the specific reasons why you feel one team is beating the other, and how the clashes and the comparisons operate. Obviously, it's a daunting or a very large task to write down everything, but I think you should write down shorthands, or have a tracking sheet where you're able to write down some sub notes, footnotes that will help you deliver the reasons why one team beats the other team in a comparative way, in a clear and concise way. Because what I'm looking for as a team is a reason why or a way in which I could have beaten the other team, okay? And if I'm able to identify where I have fucked up, or where I could have done better, or what specifically I could do, is then important for me to then go out and assess how I will improve. And that is the most important thing I'm looking forward to be doing when I have perhaps not won the debate, or not taken a first in that instance. Yes, Ojas, you can continue. Just started because you had dropped from the call.
Yeah, my bad. My laptop fully bugged out, so I'm joining from my phone.
No worries,
Um,
no worries. I just covered the structure bit. You can like continue after that. Yeah.
yeah, cool. So
Hmm.
just in terms of what you should contain, I think addressing structure addresses most of it quite comprehensively, just in terms of what you should talk about, right? What your OA should contain, like Rushdoon has already addressed, is one, what the call is, obviously. Secondly, what the rationale for that call is on each of the comparisons. And for this, I think it's important that you take notes during delib, or if your memory is good, just keep in mind what happened in delib, and what your final decision was on consensus for why a certain call is what you reached, right? The second thing you should probably do, and especially if there is a dissent, is that you should most definitely be talking about why that dissent occurred, because a dissent usually indicates that there is a certain level of ambiguity or closeness in that debate, right? So it's important then to address that ambiguity or closeness and talk to the teams about why that occurred and what the contention was on the panel. Perhaps not at length, but it's important to address so teams can know what they did right and wrong. So the team that won needs to know what worked, but also needs to know what the pitfall was that could have led to a loss in that same round, right? So just that comprehensiveness in terms of what the rationale was. Um, Let me just pull up the slides because I have to look at them. Cool. Lastly, and I think in terms of just so if there's any questions up to now in terms of either structure or in terms of the content, be happy to answer. If not, I'll just move on to how to avoid shit marking. Cool. I think not. Just feel free to ask at any time. I think there are two key ways to address like avoid shit marking, right? One is the correct way, and that is just to get better. And the other is sort of the short term band aid fix, right? And the short term band aid fixes are many. One is just to be a likable person. I think that's it helps. But specifically in terms of your OA, what people often do with varying levels of success to get better scores is to pander. That is where teams have taken horrible losses to sort of pad that loss and to explain it in such a way that makes it sound closer than it is to get spam on Mixi. Yes, it doesn't work for me. I get shit marked all the time. The spamming doesn't help. But so back to what I was saying. So basically, you can try and soften the blow so that teams that have taken the loss are more generous to you in terms of score. But this comes with the significant trade off of better teams who have done well in that round scoring you low because they feel that you haven't done justice to their arguments, right? There's always this balancing act in terms of if you must pander, you should do it in such a way that you don't look like you are being unjust or like that your call was biased towards a team or in any other way, right? So in general, the way to not get shit marked is just to do a good job. And this doing a good job looks like being comprehensive with your OA, having an accurate call, having a justification for that call. So if you look at the chair scale, right, that debaters are supposed to abide by when they score their chairs, it's possible for you to give an OA where you had an inaccurate call but still get a okay-ish score. The reason that that is the case is that the job of the OA is to explain why you reached a call. And as long as you reach that objective, you won't get a perfect score, but you will still not get like a 4 or 3 from a decent team because they will acknowledge that you had a rationale and the rationale was like in some world justifiable. So the idea is be comprehensive, be clear, and be fair to teams. If you must, if you of course in the short term want to improve your score, the way to do that is to like I said, soften the blow, make it easier for teams to bite the bullet in terms of why they lost, be nicer to them, etc., etc. But these are all very short-term fixes that may backfire, and the only real way to avoid getting shit marked is to just get better. That the way to get better scores is to get better. That's all I'll say, and that's it from me.
Yeah. I mean, so I would disagree a bit there in terms of the pandering idea. So I know this is a thing. Like this is like a whole idea in terms of okay, um, like soften the blow and stuff like that. I think there's a better way to perhaps think about it, and I don't necessarily think it kind of improves your scores like significantly because as Ojas very rightly pointed out over there that being a good judge and doing things fairly is the way in which you get better scores. Okay, and I mean, this is obviously notwithstanding some teams that may just shit mark you. That's a part and parcel of the game. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. Like, you can't just sit and cry that, oh, I did all the things right. Why were they just so not reciprocative or why were they so obtuse in that way? And that will always happen. Um, what you could do, and I think this is something I was having a conversation with Pranav about this a few days back, is just that try to be more empathetic. Because I think often novice teams or teams that have lesser experience or teams that have not done a lot of debating um, may feel very emotionally attached to the call. They may be like, I deserve that second or I deserve the first or why did I get that third or why did I get that fourth? And often you may be at the brunt of it if you're just speaking in clear terms and being like, okay, your argument was not proven. Okay, like you just said this. There's a difference between saying your argument was not proven and didn't have these burdens and saying the fact that like I think you were trying to communicate an idea that had a lot of value, that idea that you could have mobilized, but you fell short of that because of specific metrics or because of specific burdens that you were not able to fulfill. So these are things like how do you phrase it? How do you communicate. And this is something that's more important with novice teams, obviously, again, with schools teams as well, in terms of like the way you would want to like frame your OA and stuff like that. Um, Try to understand their perspective, because they're a debater trying to win the debate. So obviously, this doesn't mean to say you be overtly sensitive about everything, because you are the chair or you are the judge, and you have to complete your OA in time, right? And you have to be you have to call a spade at times. Like, you can't sugarcoat things to the extent that you're not communicating the actual essence of it. Which means to say, even if you're saying that your idea had value, be sure to mention the fact that they didn't fulfill those burdens, because it is their growth that you're able to prioritize, and it is their ability to get better that is like enhanced at a point of time you do so. And I'll give you an example, okay? And this from my personal experience. So I remember there's this team, and I don't know whether they debate anymore, from NMIMS, that I gave two fourths to in IIT Bombay 2023 Jan, okay? So you would assume that they would get really pissed. It would be like, this is the judge that we encounter all the time and gives us faults. I met them in October in IIT Bombay 2023, and they got pretty good. They broke open. I think they reached like semi-finals or something. And I met them once in the hallway, and one of the things they told me is, thank you so much for giving us those faults and pointing out what our flaws were. And that's the reason why we were able to improve. So it's not like, oh, if you just are honest and like blunt about it at times, that teams would be hating you forever. So it's not that you need to be a people pleaser. There is no rule as such. Okay, be empathetic, but also call a spade and try to like tell them their mistakes so that they can go and work on them and improve, and they will be more appreciative of it, because that is the educational aspect of debating for like people like us, the Rohan, for who got about this entire initiative. And I guess I'll become a bit senti over here at the end. You've had no coaching, you've had no experience. The only way you can get better, especially in the Indian circuit, with so much like barriers that would be there to international debating, is the fact that you have good judges who are giving you good feedback, and that's what you work on and you learn on. Yeah, so that's all from my side. Thanks, Rohan. Thanks for getting us.
My just one last bit of sort of feedback I would say is just that I think you should tailor your OA by the room. So I mean that's what I do. If I'm giving an OA to a room which has people like Vansh and Sai and Angat, etc., etc., and all these people are people who are extremely experienced and probably to a great extent aware of what they're doing wrong. It helps to be more blunt. It's often what these teams expect, as compared to, like Rushdoon said, a room full of like four teams of first years who started debating 3 days ago. Like they probably expect different things and will probably react to the same information in different ways. What you shouldn't do is tailor your OA to an extent where it's just a different OA. It probably should be the same OA delivered differently. And how people react to your OA is probably not like something you're responsible for. And that's something you should keep in mind. So even if you get marked very badly for something, that usually isn't a reflection on you as a judge. Just for reference, I've had feedback at competitions where I've been called worst judge ever this year. So it's clearly that in some instances you can't do anything about a salty team and you should just move on. And being more honest with teams and being more honest as a judge is probably your best way to get better as a judge, but also to ensure that you have like a okayish reputation as a good judge. Because if you are doing things that are duplicitous and you are being misleading and you are just pandering, you get a reputation for pandering. Like you don't get a reputation as a good judge by lying to people. Is all I will say.
Yeah, sorry to again extend. Rohan will hate me again. Don't make rep calls, please. However easy that may be the case.
Also, don't make anti-rep calls. Just like sometimes there is a temptation to
No, but
impose a
also
higher burden.
I think it's more tempting to be a rep call, to make a rep call, because you'll be like, okay, this person will get pissed and this person will CA me or whatever,
Yeah,
and I just exclude the thoughts from your head, because the
yeah.
team that you're perhaps giving a win perhaps doesn't have the rep now. What if they have rep 1 year later, okay, and then
But
the
also
debating is a funny sport, okay, and that's not the specific reason, but it's just like be fair, yeah.
But also objectively, if you give a team that's very experienced a win when they don't deserve one, they will not think of you as a good judge, like because they know they don't deserve the win, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there's that.
And
So
teams that just get mad about it, like fuck them. Honestly, sorry.
okay.
Yeah.
So lastly, before I close out, I'm just going to say that you should. Wait, what was I going to say? I forgot. Sorry. Oh yeah. So the anti-rep thing. There's a temptation to impose higher burdens on people you see as good teams, just because you think they should really do better. While weighing, while comparing, avoid that because what team is making the argument shouldn't matter, right? And similarly, avoid like spending less time on teams because they know what they're doing. Like give every team a fair chance in your weighing and in your rowing. I think that's it. That's the end of the session from my end. Thank you so much for all five of you who are still here. Thanks, Rohan, for having us. And this went on for much longer than we thought it would.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rushdoon. Thank you so much, Ojas, for the lovely session. Does anyone have any questions?
I think
I
this has
think
been very long, Rohan. Like this is like two
yes.
hours and shit.
Yes,
I
Yeah.
think
So
everyone's
most
let's.
of
fun
got through
listening.
to us.
So
We've also answered a lot of questions
one
during the
feedback
session.
I have also is just that we should make the session shorter and like if you're having it long, then we should divide the sessions into two.